Chapter 971 Restraint on the observation deck of the liner. The bugle was sounded. It tore through the obstacles put up by the wind and rain, awakening all the passengers on board. Unable to dress up in time, they could only don a coat or their pajamas, rushing barefoot to the window to observe the situation outside. Half of the passengers quickly saw a gigantic sailboat that didn't adhere to common sense. They saw its 3 pitch-black sails and the blob of pale flickering yellow amidst the dark environment. Together with the howling winds, spattering rain, and the moonless and starless night sky, many passengers felt as though the ship was approaching them from hell, bringing with it an inexplicable sense of horror and dominance. After a brief pause and frenzy, a name surfaced in their minds: Black Emperor. Anyone who had been out at sea for some time, or people who lived in port cities in the various colonies, more or less knew the existence of such a pirate ship. Sigh, may the storm be with you and me. May the goddess watch over us. Holy Lord of Storms. As the passengers subconsciously made prayers, they were filled with horror and helplessness. These passengers knew very well that the owner of the Black Emperor had the highest bounty on the 5 seas. In a particular sense, he was the king of pirates, and was a powerful figure who could remain alive despite the campaigns of the various fleets from different nations. He was definitely not someone the cannons and crew of a liner could resist. This meant that they were about to fall into the hands of pirates. Many women couldn't help but imagine being raped by the pirates and being sold to unfamiliar lands. Some trembled while others collapsed to the ground. Some rummaged for daggers or revolvers. It was unknown if they wanted to resist, or if they were unwilling to face the worst outcome. Having failed to find weapons, some moved a clothes rack to their side. The men didn't react any better. Apart from a number of them drawing weapons in a bid to organize themselves to resist, the remaining froze in a daze or sought places to hide. Others cursed the darn liner and the king of the 5 seas. Finally, the captain's voice boomed into the ears of every passenger via the broadcasting equipment or something else. Silence! Don't be afraid. The owner of the Black Emperor has his own code. He's not like other pirates. His subordinates can only plunder for items and wealth, nothing else. Such words were repeated a few times as the panicking passengers finally calmed down and no longer exhibited such horror. Compared to the outcomes they had imagined, being able to live and not be raped was an excellent outcome. Almost a minute late, a number of passengers were overwhelmed with sadness and cried upon realizing how their hard-earned savings would be wiped out. Some of them were doing business through loans. If they were unable to pay their loans, it was possible that their family would end up on the streets, relying on the workhouses for survival. Upon having this thought, they hurriedly took action and hid their wealth in all kinds of hidden compartments, hoping to keep as much as they could from the pirates. After doing this, they held their weapons tight, prepared to fight the pirates to the death at critical moments. Even feral beasts would fight back when cornered. Why not humans? At this moment, many of the pirates on the Black Emperor were waiting by the broadside according to their orders. They were prepared to jump onto the prey once the distance was closed. Their second mate, Horror Viscount Bird Mustang, was holding a telescope as he observed the liner opposite him without much thought. He was inwardly calculating how much longer before the 2 ships met. This pirate, whose bounty had exceeded 10,000 pounds, wore an inta-styled shirt with complicated patterns on his sleeves and collars. He donned a dark red captain's attire, as though he was awaiting the commencement of a ball, and not a pirate attack. Suddenly, his vision blurred and he could no longer see the liner. Bird Mustang hurriedly searched with his telescope, but regardless of the direction he aimed it at, there was nothing but stormy waves and red-headed sea eagles who enjoyed hunting fish during storms. Such a huge liner had vanished. The light in Bird Mustang's eyes flickered as he failed to make an accurate judgment. Where's the ship? Where did such a huge ship go? It was still around. The pirates on deck also noticed something amiss as they exclaimed. A ghost ship? No, there aren't any ghost ships with such a make. This is a steam and sail hybrid that got popular in recent decades. An illusion? Someone had hidden a liner with a large-scale illusion? An illusion at this scale has to have been done by a demigod. Bird Mustang's thoughts raced as he retracted his telescope and headed for the cabin. During this process, the distance he traveled seemed to distort. In about 8 steps, Bird Mustang covered quite a sizable distance and arrived in front of the captain's cabin. He reverently bowed and said, "Earl Nast, something abnormal has happened with the hunt." On the Black Emperor, King of the 5 Seas, Nast continued having himself addressed as an earl, as it was a title conferred upon him by Emperor Roselle. Of course, he had publicly announced that it was a matter of time before he established a pirate's kingdom, becoming a duke, king, or even an emperor. After a brief silence, a solemn voice sounded from the captain's cabin. "Circle around it. By your will." Bird Mustang didn't ask why as he directly accepted the order. Of course he could imagine the reason. Be it an illusion or not, to make such a huge steam and sail hybrid liner vanish from the scrutiny of hundreds of pirates, it was definitely not something a low or mid-sequence beyonder could accomplish. The ship definitely had a demigod or a powerhouse wielding a demigod-level sealed artifact. And to clash with an unknown demigod for an ordinary liner was definitely an irrational act. Even if the Earl of White Maple Nast, as the King of the Five Seas, he wouldn't do such rash acts unless there was something worth fighting for. From this angle, the demigod was only hiding on the liner and had not launched any counterattack. This also implied that he didn't wish to clash with the Black Emperor and the King of the Five Seas. Therefore, he had only exhibited his existence for shock and awe purposes. Bird Mustang immediately got the sailors to leave the broadside and turn the Black Emperor around. At this point, a huge and heavy red-headed sea eagle suddenly flew out of its flock and headed for the Black Emperor, spiraling above the ghost ship. Amidst the pirates' confusion, the red-headed sea eagle looked down upon the deck and spoke deeply in a human's voice. "I wish to meet the Earl of White Maple." Bird Mustang was taken aback for a second before he cast his eyes at the cabin. King of the Five Seas Nast's solemn voice sounded again. Instead of directly answering the sea eagle, he instructed his subordinates, "Let him in." Bird Mustang immediately followed the order as the sea eagle swooped down in the storm. Its body gradually changed and turned into a humanoid form. When it landed on the deck, it was no longer a red-headed sea eagle, but a man with a tall top hat and tuxedo. His face wore a feathered mask. Bird Mustang's eyes dilated slightly as though he was trying to take in the figure clearer. But no matter how much he observed it, he was unable to discover anything abnormal about this exaggerated man. It was as though there wasn't a red-headed sea eagle from the very beginning. A few seconds later, Bird Mustang's pupils dilated even more because he saw the figure's side profile when it walked past him. This man, who appeared like he was an invitee at a banquet, was very thin. His side profile was about the width of 2 fingers. At that instant, Bird Mustang felt as though he was seeing a walking paper figurine, but it was also slightly thicker than one. A monster. He gulped with great difficulty as he watched the terrifying demigod walk towards the cabin. The pirates on deck quickly retreated and leaned against the shipboard as though a nightmare had just walked past them. To them, this abnormally proportioned man was something they had never seen before. It was more harrowing than the many monsters they had seen in the past. At the 3rd story of the cabin, outside the captain's cabin, Klein held the handle, twisted it, and opened the door. The reason he had made himself appear so strange was partially due to having no choice, but it was also partially deliberate. The former was because the red-headed sea eagle wasn't big enough, so after creating the clothes and mask, there was no way to create a normal human's body, even without the innards. The deliberate choice was because he was beginning to try out his theories on acting as a bizarro sorcerer. He had some ideas regarding this. The term sorcerer wasn't key. What was key was to use the methods of a sorcerer to appear bizarre. With a light creak, the dark black door opened, revealing the interior of the captain's cabin. Candle lamps drooped down from above, with 41 on the left and 40 on the right in an asymmetrical manner. At the end of it, a black platform rose up, surrounding an iron-black chair. King of the Five Seas Nast's figure was relatively normal. He was slightly taller than 1.9 meters, unlike the non-human form which resembled a giant that Klein had previously encountered. He was still wearing a miniaturized crown with a black robe with silver ends. He had a squarish face with slight wrinkles. He had a short black mustache underneath his chin, and his black eyes swirled with a red glow. It made one bow their heads without realizing it. "I've never met you before," Nast said in a deep voice. "Mr. Bizarro Sorcerer." Klein took off his hat and bowed. "You know me now." Nast made his voice which made spirit bodies tremble resound inside the captain's cabin. "Speak. Why are you visiting me?" "Emperor, I wish to know of your impression of Emperor Roselle. Everyone knows that you and your father have met him in the past far more than once," Klein replied without being affected. Nast swept the paper figurine-like demigod as his dark red light brightened significantly. "Have a seat first." Before he finished his sentence, Klein felt a potent suppressive force on him. His body involuntarily sat on a chair beside him. However, he was only here as a marionette. With a flick of the spirit body threads, the figure that was thin as a book had quickly restored its balance. Chapter 972 Nast's memories. With the pressure relieved, Klein casually pulled a chair over and placed it by the door, sitting opposite King of the Five Seas Nast with the entire hall separating them. Although the Pirate King was more than 9 meters tall and was sitting on a black platform, allowing him to look down in a domineering manner, Klein didn't play second fiddle in this encounter. He wore his tall top hat again. After a brief silence, Nast, who had the official title of Earl of White Maple, said with a solemn tone, "Give me a reason why I should answer your question." Klein's thin body casually leaned back as he said, "You will not need to hear the same request when you have something you need to trade with me in the future." The dark red light flickered in Nast's black eyes as he said, "I basically know all the saints active in this world, but that doesn't include you." Klein caressed the feathered mask on his face and laughed. Without answering, he asked in return, "Have you met Zeratul?" "I've met him twice in Emperor Rosel's palace. I'd also interacted with quite a number of secret order members," Nast replied with a calm and direct but extremely domineering tone. "Quite a number of secret order members. You should introduce me to them when the opportunity arises." Klein couldn't help but quip. He then smiled and said, "I've also met Zeratul." Nast raised his hand to stroke his short black beard. His already tall figure seemed to burgeon, making the mood in the captain's cabin even gloomier and repressed. After a few seconds, he stared at Klein from above and said, "My impression of Emperor Rosel is very simple. No one is more suitable than him to be the Black Emperor." He didn't explain what Black Emperor meant or pointed to, ignoring if the demigod opposite him understood or not. "Is that so?" From this King of the Five Seas' words, although the Emperor's diary implied that he made up his mind only in his later years to switch to the Black Emperor pathway and make preparations, he had long had such inclinations. He had unconsciously exhibited it and set up the situation ahead of time. Klein thought in enlightenment. He believed that Nast's impression of Emperor Rosel was limited to that. After all, they had only met a few times. Hence, he switched topics. "In the Emperor's later years, did he get you or your father to do something secret?" Nast's crown shook a little as he replied, "Someone had once asked me the same question." Klein laughed and asked with a bold guess, "Bernadette?" "Yes." Nast held the two sides of his black throne with his hands. Back then, she was very young and immature to ask such a question. With Emperor Rosel's level in his later years, compared to handing something secret to me and my father, what could be kept more secret than doing it himself? This is implying that I'm as immature as Bernadette back then. Klein sighed and said, "To people who are concerned about this, one wouldn't abandon even the slightest sliver of hope." This was also why he wished to meet the King of the Five Seas after concealing the liner. He was now trying to find clues to the door of light above the gray fog in the real world. Apart from confirming who the third transmigrator was, he had to delve deep into Emperor Rosel's matters. This was a necessary decision. The dark red glow in Nast's eyes contracted and expanded. "What's your relationship with Emperor Rosel?" Klein thought and said with a sigh, "We can be considered old friends." After all, they had been above that mysterious door of light, and the cocoons they were in were neighbors with only a thin obstacle in between them. They had been hanging there for centuries or even millennia. This was a connection that stemmed from reality, and psychologically, having read so many of the Emperor's diaries, Klein had long treated the Emperor as a fellow countryman. He shared the same feelings for home and sense of identity with him. Nast stared at the thin demigod who sat by the door before he retracted his gaze and solemnly said, "Any more questions?" Klein was already prepared. He asked in an unhurried tone, "Do you feel that there was anything abnormal about Emperor Rosel in his later years?" The slightly wrinkled Nast remained silent for quite a while before saying, "I don't know enough about him, so I wasn't able to notice anything abnormal. The only thing that made me feel odd was that when me and my father met him, he would stand at a floor-to-ceiling window facing west. He would stare into the distance. This would happen in the morning, noon, and the evening. And that room wasn't the only one with a floor-to-ceiling window. West. Into the distance. The fog sea? Klein seemed to mutter to himself as though seeking confirmation. He recalled that the Emperor's diary had mentioned of a mysterious primitive island, and he recalled the abyss that hid somewhere in the fog sea. Nast nodded slightly and said, "That was my guess as well." Phew. Klein silently exhaled. After some consideration, he stood up and said, I'm done with my questions. Please pardon me for my intrusion. Your lordship, I wonder if I can help you in a transaction? He was fulfilling his promise. Nast fell silent for 2 seconds and said, "Help me find the card of blasphemy that corresponds to the Black Emperor." For an instant, Klein suspected that the Pirate King was testing him, but he immediately felt that an unknown demigod had little to do with the Black Emperor card. He said with a smile, "I'll try my best. However, the questions from before aren't worth a card of blasphemy. If I can obtain it, I'll trade you for the information inside it. Of course, I might only provide clues to that card." Nast caressed the armrest of his iron-black throne and said in a deadpan manner, "So be it." Klein took off his hat again, bowed, and turned to leave before returning to the deck. Under Horror Viscount Bird Mustang and Company's gaze, he raised his arms. His body rapidly contracted as the feather mask on his face spread out. In just 2 or 3 seconds, his entire person became an ordinary red-headed sea eagle. This sea eagle immediately flapped its wings, flying into the dark storm, vanishing from the sights of the pirates of the Black Emperor. "That's a demigod." Bird Mustang looked into midair and sighed. Although making a further advancement at Sequence 5 increased the inclination towards madness and a loss of control, making it highly possible for Beyonders to fail their advancement, the title of being a demigod remained attractive. As long as one successfully took the step, they could attain godhood, allowing their life to undergo a fundamental change. Be it in terms of lifespan or powers, it far exceeded that of humans, allowing them to reign above all. On the liner, Klein abandoned his control over the red-headed sea eagle, allowing it to plunge into the sea to be fish food without anyone seeing it. And at this moment, the passengers on board felt high-strung because the Black Emperor was about to approach. In fact, this should have happened a few minutes ago, but for some reason, the Black Emperor had ignored the liner and headed forward. Yet, the liner didn't use this opportunity to escape, and it had instead circled around the Black Emperor, maintaining a few hundred meters from it. This bizarre situation continued for a while before it finally ended, leaving dozens of meters between the two ships. The Black Emperor passed the liner and steered into the stormy night without returning. The passengers and crew watched blankly and realized the reality of the situation only a few minutes later. The Black Emperor was gone. It hadn't attempted to plunder them. A number of passengers cheered while others had tears stream down their faces. A few collapsed to the ground and relaxed. Only a few maintained their lucidity, feeling puzzled as to everything that had happened. However, they were unable to find an answer that agreed with the situation at hand. All they could do was console themselves. The Black Emperor must have completed a plunder already. Since this is a liner and not a cargo ship, it didn't catch its eye. As the euphoria spread across the ship, Klein, donning the appearance of Dwayne Dantes, cast his gaze to the north. Compared to King of the Five Seas Nast, who had only met Roselle a few times, there was another person who knew the Emperor even better: Queen Mystic Bernadette. Being an equal peer to Nast, she had recently been in Backlund. "After I return to Backlund, I'll get Admiral of Stars to contact Queen Mystic and try to meet her as soon as possible." Klein retracted his gaze, drew the curtains, and went to bed. In the Rorstad Archipelago waters, on the future, Admiral of Stars Katlia finally received a letter from Queen Mystic Bernadette. She had no idea when the invisible messenger arrived, but this didn't stop her from effusing her joy. Tearing open the envelope and spreading open the letter, Katlia eagerly read the first line below the salutation. "That's indeed Seal's descendant. That artisan is really Emperor Roselle's direct descendant. I can't allow him to mix with the believers of the primordial moon. I have to bring him on board the future." As Katlia thought, she nodded indiscernibly. After making up her mind, she thought of Artisan Sealf's character and morals that only spelled trouble. She felt that she had the responsibility and duty to discipline him. Amidst her deliberation, she walked to the window of the captain's cabin and cast her gaze outside. After some searching, her gaze fell onto the shipboard where Frank Lee was munching on mushrooms. "Frank!" Katlia shouted out with her normal tone. Frank, who had his sleeves rolled up, snapped out of his deep thought. "Captain, is there something?" Katlia said seriously, "I'll get you an assistant for your experiments." Frank was taken aback before he revealed a pure smile. "All right." Chapter 973 New Angel. Upon seeing Frank's smile, Katlia had mixed feelings. She then retracted her gaze and turned it to the nearby fishing village where the future was docked. No one expected this place to be an important base of the Moses ascetic order. To avoid the pursuit of the Aurora order, Katlia and her crew had been docked here recently. She wasn't in a rush to set sail but was prepared to go ashore. She planned on using the equipment in the fishing village to make contact with her subordinates who were monitoring artisan Sealf in Byam. Through that, she could confirm the situation and make plans. Only with this in place could the future set sail again. Headed for the capital of the Rørsted archipelago, Byam, that was several days away. In Backlund, the sky brightened especially early in July, but the overall temperature wasn't considered hot. It didn't even exceed 30 degrees Celsius. Emlyn wore a top hat to shelter him from the sunlight that penetrated the clouds as he disembarked a carriage and walked into the Harvest Church. Looking over, he saw the mountain-like Father Utravsky, who wore a brown priest robe and a clergyman's bonnet. He was standing in front of the sacred emblem of life, preaching to the few believers that came to pray in the morning. Emlyn didn't take a second look as he walked straight to the back of the cathedral. He arrived in a room that he called his, and he familiarly changed into his priest robes. As he wiped the candlestands, he waited for the believers to leave. About 20 minutes later, he finally found an opportunity to sit beside Bishop Utravsky and muttered to himself while looking at the sacred emblem of life, "Father, I have a question I would like to consult you about." The thin-browed, light blue-eyed Bishop Utravsky with some clear wrinkles replied with a smile, "Go ahead." Emlyn held his breath and verbalized the words he had been thinking over the entire night. And I'm saying, if there's a distant relative who fools you, making you and your friend fall into danger and almost lose your life, and this matter isn't suitable in court, how would you punish him? Despite sitting down, Utravsky remained like a hill. He said in a deep but gentle voice, "First, you have to confirm if the relative had made a mistake due to negligence, or if he had deliberately fooled you and lead you into a trap. If it's the former, you need to warn him, remind him, and teach him, instead of thinking of punishing him. If it's the latter, you still need to confirm if this is the way he usually does things. If it is, then you need to eliminate him. Otherwise, he will definitely bring more harm to others, bringing harm to innocents. By ending his life and sending him back to the land, it will restart the cycle of life. It's a type of compassion and a type of purification. Elimination. Father speaks of murder in a way that's more natural, mellow, and calmer than the world." Emlyn's facial muscles twitched as he hurriedly interrupted Utravsky's reply. "No, he usually doesn't act this way. It's just that due to various reasons, he had targeted me this once. I don't wish to kill him because of this." Just as he said that, Emlyn froze. He had apparently, probably most likely, just expressed the fact that he was the victim, expressing that this matter was a sanguine internal matter. Utravsky turned to look at him and revealed a smile. "Not bad. You already understand how precious life is." Emlyn forced a smile. "Then how should he be punished?" Utravsky looked at the sacred emblem of life in front of him. "I do not advocate appealing to violence. You can bring him here and have him listen to my preaching and reading the Bible. He will understand the value of life and experience the compassion of Earth Mother. He will serve to redeem his sins." "Isn't this what I experienced?" Emlyn was taken aback before realizing that this method was in line with his intentions. This neither caused Ernst Boyar's death, nor was it comparable to simply beating him up and demanding compensation. More importantly, this wouldn't escalate to a conflict that would cause strife among the sanguine. Of course, every method had its flaws. To Emlyn, the biggest problem was, how was he to bring Ernst Boyar to the Harvest Church? From the moment he began doing volunteer work here, all the sanguine in Backlund knew to avoid this region. Ernst Boyar was no exception. It was impossible to trick him into coming in. And if he resorted to violence, Emlyn believed that, with the ring bestowed to him by Ancestor Lilith, as well as Miss Magician's powerful spellbook that could be rented, defeating Ernst Boyar wasn't a difficult endeavor. However, to control him wasn't simple. After all, he was a sanguine viscount, equivalent to that of a Sequence 5 Beyonder. In addition, although Ernst Boyar wasn't too old, he had quite a collection. Under such circumstances, the extent of which to directly taking action was hard to gauge. It could easily lead to death, and Emlyn would be blamed for "perhaps I need some help." In Backlund, there are many members of the Tarot Club. If we work together, we should be able to easily control Ernst. I can't expose my identity because of this. The cooperation should be done in stages, so that we don't have to meet. Amidst his thoughts, Emlyn had made his decision. He planned on assigning a mission during the tarot gathering next week in search for help. He nodded gently in response to Father Yutravsky's suggestion. It sounds pretty good. I plan on making a decision a few days later after calming down. Father Yutravsky nodded and smiled. Fruits are obtained from planting them. It's a long process that requires patience. From the looks of it, you have understood this point. Of course, it's such a simple principle. Emlyn raised his chin slightly as he habitually clasped his hands and prayed to the sacred emblem of life. 22 Phelps Street. Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Audrey placed a document in hand on the table and looked up at the wall clock in the director's office. She could hardly relax. She had already made an appointment with Escalante to head over to Stephen Hampers's residence in the afternoon. Clearly, this meant a test. If the Psychology Alchemists' team was careful enough, they would have already reported the news, and there might be a counselor secretly observing everything. Based on her current level and abilities, although Audrey was unable to determine how terrifying a high-sequence spectator was, she could imagine the kinds of performance they had in certain domains. This made her uncontrollably nervous, afraid that she would be seen through. In fact, I should have delayed it a little more. Although the time and the emotions I showed are in line with logic and psychology, delaying a meeting would definitely incur suspicion. But compared to a little bit of suspicion, it's more important to wait for Mr. World to return from the southern continent. That way, I can directly arrange for them to meet at the Foundation. I don't have to worry about a high-sequence spectator discovering anything. Sigh, Audrey, your plans weren't well thought enough. Audrey sighed silently and cast placate on herself to calm her emotions. After the afternoon, she wasn't in a rush to leave the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. Sitting inside her office, she bowed her head, clasped her hands together, and softly prayed to Mr. Fool. After completing this, she got onto her carriage with Annie and Susie, heading for the residence of the furniture merchant, Stephen Hamprez. Just as the carriage began moving, Audrey suddenly saw a gorgeous beam of light appear. Amidst the beam of light, a 12-winged angel bathed with golden light descended. The wings, which were made of flames, had wrapped her in layers before they dissipated layer after layer. Audrey's vision quickly recovered as she swept her gaze past Annie and Susie through the corner of her eye in an unnoticeable manner. She realized that they hadn't noticed anything that had happened. It's a little different from the previous angel. With Mr. Fool's greater reawakening, his angels have also recovered further? As the corners of her lips quivered, Audrey wiped the smile from her face, her inner heart becoming abnormally firm. In less than half an hour, her carriage had stopped by Stephen Hampers's door. After passing her hand to Annie, Audrey was helped down the carriage, and she walked straight to the door. She watched as her attendant pulled the doorbell. Before long, Escalante came to open the door. Like before, she directly brought Audrey to the activity room on the first floor. Annie and Susie were brought to the living room by the servants. Upon arriving at the activity room, Escalante reached out to hold the doorknob as she gestured for Audrey to enter. Audrey had a guess, but she didn't show it. She slowly walked through the door which Escalante had opened. Escalante didn't enter as she closed the activity room's door. Audrey looked ahead and saw that on a single seater facing the activity room's door, there was an elder sitting there quietly. The elder wore a shirt, vest, and a jacket, matched with blue-gray trousers with lines adorning it, as well as a dark red bow tie. His hair was completely white but remained thick and lush. He had a warm and elegant bearing. He had a pair of blue eyes that seemed to hide wisdom and knowledge. Apart from the wrinkles on his forehead, he didn't have any wrinkles elsewhere. Audrey knew him. He was the royal family's consultant Vin Rambis. Of course, Audrey had long known of this old gentleman's secret identity from the Tarot Club, a counselor of the Psychology Alchemists. She didn't disguise her surprise, because she truly was surprised. Although she had guessed at the possibility of Vin Rambis's appearance, she never expected him to appear directly. She imagined that he would observe her in secret, allowing Hilbert and Stephen to speak on his behalf. "You're very surprised?" Vin Rambis asked with a faint smile. He then stood up and bowed. "A pleasure meeting you, Miss Audrey." Audrey deliberately opened her mouth before closing it again. Following that, she replied with a mixed smile, "I'm not sure how I should address you." Vin Rambis chuckled. "Like always." He pointed to the sofa beside them. "Let's have a seat." Audrey took a deep breath, wore a smile, and unhurriedly walked over. Sitting by the sofa, She maintained an adequate distance from him. Chapter 974 Mind World. Vin Rambus picked up the porcelain teacup and took a sip. Looking at Audrey, who sat in a flawless posture, he said genially, "There's no need to act so reserved. This isn't our first meeting. I still recall discussing Berman's philosophy of ethics and Kongsoka's pragmatism with you 2 years ago." Audrey smiled faintly and said, "I just find it difficult to put the idea of you and a psychology alchemist's counselor together." Vin Rambus hadn't introduced himself, but it was a reasonable inference based on Audrey's knowledge of the psychology alchemists and the present situation. Vin crossed his right leg and said with a smile, "This isn't something worth paying attention to. Never forget that our Psychology Alchemists is an organization established with the goal of studying the psyche and to build knowledge. We are more about the academic side of things rather than handling matters. Since it's academic, you can always treat a counselor as a university's professor." If she hadn't learned from Mr. World that Vin Rambus was behind Quarren's suicide, Audrey would have been able to conclude that he was a knowledgeable, amiable, humorous, and humble scholar, regardless of the amount of observation that she did. However, since she was wary, Audrey wasn't someone who would so easily believe things that appeared on the surface. As she looked at him and organized her words, she prevented herself from focusing too much on one point. She kept her thoughts lively and scattered to prevent herself from being hypnotized. At this moment, her mind suddenly turned adrift. She seemed to see the 7 pure lights that contained infinite knowledge, and the dense, indescribable figures. She saw them blanketing everything from high above. This was the spirituality sky, the reflection of the spirituality in one's mind. And beneath the spirituality sky was a deep, dark sea. Every drop of water resembled a point of light as though they represented an imprint on each subconscious. Near this sea were several islands. One of them belonged to Audrey. She clearly knew that this was a manifestation of her consciousness. What was exposed above the sea was what she could detect, and the parts covered by the seawater were her deeper consciousness that she was usually unable to grasp or know. Floating above the island, Audrey looked to the bottom. She first noticed that the area was a solitary, quiet, gray blur. They screened out her vision, making her only capable of seeing the massive and dark black outlines of the subconscious, as well as the illusory and rippling sea of collective subconscious. She was unable to obtain much information from that. Audrey was puzzled as to how she had entered this strange state when she saw large swaths of gray split apart like the sea deep in the sea of subconscious at the island below. It revealed a stone platform that had appeared at some point in time. On the platform, a figure grew up rapidly in a fashion akin to blinking, entering Audrey's field of view almost instantly. His hair was completely white but remained thick and lush. He wore a standard 3-piece suit, matched with blue-gray trousers with lines adorning it, as well as a dark red bow tie. This man with deep wrinkles on his forehead was none other than Vin Rambus. Compared to the Vin sitting on the sofa, he appeared more sinister. He didn't wear a smile, and his head was slightly bowed. It was as though he was observing Audrey's subconscious that lay behind. In a few steps, he walked into Audrey's island of consciousness through the sea of collective subconscious. Then, he went from the subconscious to the area exposed above the sea like a silent visitor who didn't knock on the door or receive any permission. After arriving on the island, Vin Rambus raised his head. His facial skin was already covered in grayish-white scales. His irises were gold and vertical, and it didn't show any hint of emotion. Floating in midair, Audrey observed this scene and fully understood the situation she was in. This was the world of the mind, a mind world formed by the spirituality sky, sea of collective subconscious, and the island of consciousness. Due to the blessings from Mr. Fool's angel, Vin Rambus's intrusion of my body of heart and mind and psyche through the sea of collective subconscious sounded alarms. That force has separated my most fundamental part of my self-conscious, allowing me to control everything on the island from the spirituality sky. Thus, I'm able to truly resist true forms of telepathy. How magical. No, how despicable of Vin Rambus. He's not polite at all. He intruded into my house, without gaining any permission or providing any notification. Audrey grumbled in midair. After understanding her current situation, she secretly controlled the changes that were influencing the island while answering the casually seated Vin Rambus in the real world. I'm also very reserved when facing university professors. As she spoke, Audrey made her inner island mumble. This isn't a good analogy. As an elderly psychology alchemist's counselor, he should be a sequence 4 at least. This is a demigod, one that naturally makes one feel fear, awe, and reserved. On the sofa, Vin Rambus chuckled immediately. Then I won't be forcing you. I've heard about you from Hilbert. I heard that you've advanced from psychiatrist to hypnotist in a short few months. I'm very curious about how you did it. Oh, I've also heard of the answer you gave Escalante, having the courage to make use of matters. However, I wish to hear something more detailed. At this moment, the Vin Rambus on Audrey's mind island was observing his surroundings with a deadpan expression, listening the resonating voice. Audrey was already prepared for this as she deliberately pretended to be organizing her words. After a few seconds she said, "It's just the superficial meaning of having courage to make use of matter. Let's put it this way. In my future plans, I've always had one of my options being a psychiatrist. Since I've acquired the corresponding Beyonder powers, I was definitely very happy to try it out and help the people around me resolve their mental and psychological problems." While saying that, she showed some signs of embarrassment towards such actions that bordered on childishness. Her mind island faithfully reflected this. After a pause, Audrey continued, "During this process, I discovered that my control over the potion's powers became better until, one day, I felt something in me shatter and fuse into my blood. It also allowed me to vaguely see illusory stars. Mr. Rambus, what does it represent?" For some reason, I firmly decided to become a hypnotist from that day. This might also be a cue from my subconscious. After saying that, Audrey deliberately stuck out her tongue on her mind island like when she was little, doing things she usually wouldn't do. It was a way to prove that she was feeling a little embarrassed because playing psychiatrist was no different from playing princess when she was little. And embarrassment often meant the truth. Vin Rambus nodded gently and said, "Very talented. You seem to have figured out the acting method by yourself." Acting method? Audrey wore a surprised and blank look both inside and outside before coming to a realization. Vin Rambus said with a genial smile, "It's exactly as you think it is. By acting based on the potion's name, and concluding the corresponding principles, that will speed up the digestion of the potion. It is an effective method for reducing the negative influences. However, before Sequence 6, we do not teach it because we do not advocate members using this method to accelerate the digestion of their potions. Surprisingly, you have figured it out yourself. Why don't you advocate it?" Audrey asked sincerely out of curiosity. Vin Rambus sighed and said, "This will make the members not be themselves. Some might even be assimilated by the remnants of the potion. To put it simply, the first 3 sequences are for one to slowly grasp their powers and get used to being extraordinary. It allows one's subconscious to be deeper, become clearer, and turn more mature. It aids in resisting the subsequent problems that come from the acting method. Of course, I can only give my opinion on the spectator pathway. As for the other Beyonder pathways, I'm not too sure if they're the same. But clearly, pathways that focus on the domain of the mind would have some differences in the area of self-consciousness." Audrey was unable to determine the veracity of Vin Rambus's words. She felt that there was definitely some reason to it, but it was not entirely the truth. Little Sun mentioned before that one key thing to remember regarding the acting method is, remember that you're only acting. I find this more appropriate. Yes, I've been strictly abiding to it, and will keep doing so in the future. Audrey, you mustn't be careless. From this moment forth, you must put more emphasis on your self-consciousness. From Mr. Fool's point of view, this must be trivial and doesn't require additional emphasis since it's included in the statement of only acting. But to the ordinary person, perhaps it's relatively more important. As Audrey's thoughts raced, she asked, "Can you explain the acting method in more detail?" Vin Rambus explained it to her in a relatively more detailed manner before saying, "You are indeed talented and qualified to obtain the Sequence 5 Dreamwalker potion formula, but before that, I'll give you several missions. This is out of fairness and also a form of training for you. This is because once you achieve Sequence 5, you will be leading 2 to 3 psychological discussion groups. Your every judgment and choice will influence the future and even the lives of the members beneath you. Therefore, we mustn't allow people who deeply lack experience in handling matters to advance to Sequence 5. Understandable. Audrey didn't object to it. What's the first mission? Vin Rambus said with a smile. A simple but rather long-term mission. Every piece of feedback you provide will count towards your contributions. At this point, he sighed. The fracture between the new party and the Conservative Party is widening. The more conflict there is, the more divided the kingdom's internal politics will be. I wish that you can take note of the attitude of your father, Earl Hall. Inform me of some of his views towards various bills and matters. Don't worry, this will not cause him any harm. We only wish to mend the fractures. His final statement was, in fact, not supported by logic. It was solely a promise. But with Vin Rambus raising his right hand to his temples while on Audrey's mind island, Audrey felt that what he said was very reasonable and deeply relatable. Floating above her mind world, she immediately snapped to her senses and realized something was amiss. At that moment, Audrey felt as though she had dissociated into two entities. One was a result of a mind island. She could no longer remember the appearance or name of the elder in front of her. She only knew that she had come to Stephen Hampers's residence and met a psychology alchemist's counselor where she received the approbation of the acting method and received a new mission. Another her floated beneath the spirituality sky, acutely aware of everything that had happened. However, there wasn't much emotional changes. It was more optimistic than gloomy. Audrey was certain that the one in midair was her true self-conscious. Therefore, she didn't feel confounded. With her as the true self, she controlled her other self and got up in a muddle. "Yes, sir." After answering him, she rapidly straightened her body, and like a puppet who is being controlled by invisible strings, she walked to the door and left. At the instant she closed the door, the her in the mind world sky and the her corresponding to the island of consciousness fused as one. There were no longer any differences. The two entities with certain memory discrepancies instantly fused together, giving Audrey a few seconds of confusion. However, with plenty of experience in treating people and hypnotizing others, she very quickly and skillfully identified the differences. She then reconstructed every detail from before. What powerful mind reading and hypnosis! He directly entered my body of heart and mind and even my soul body to exert influence via the sea of collective subconscious. Although Audrey had the blessings of the Fool's Angel, she felt that her recollections were like viewing old photographs. They were yellowed and faded, as though they were matters that happened years ago. I'll be able to do the same in the future. The blessings of Mr. Fool's Angel is really impressive. Humph, I'll only inform you of Father's take on unimportant matters. As Audrey's mind whirled, her mood turned for the better. Whoosh! The steam locomotive that spewed out copious amounts of smoke dragged its carriages as it chugged into Backlund. After traveling for days, Klein had finally returned to this capital of capitals. As Dwayne Dantes, Klein wore a top hat and a formal suit while holding a gold-inlaid cane. He slowly left the first-class cabin and firmly stood on the platform. Behind him was a man with mixed blood. He was about 1.75 meters tall, and he carried 2 luggage bags. He was none other than the marionette, Enzo. Of course, this winner had already changed his name to Anuni, which sounded more in line with the Southern Continent's traditions. In the future, he would be the go-to person to establish contact with the Southern Continent's clientele for the upstart tycoon and arms dealer, Dwayne Dantes. The non-crucial business would be handled by him, without needing Dwayne Dantes to personally head to East and West Balam. Of course, this was simply a disguise. In fact, Klein would be the one making the trip. He had decided to send believers to West Balam in the name of sea god Calvetua and get them to represent himself to complete some small-scale deals. After all, Danitz was an infamous pirate over the 5 seas, with a bounty exceeding £10,000. Furthermore, he had close ties with Gehrman Sparrow, and it easily incurred suspicion if he kept helping Dwayne Dantes. After leaving the station, Klein rode a carriage and returned to 160 Backlund Street. It was already dark by then. The street lamps on both sides of the street had already lit up, likewise for Dwayne Dantes's residence. Butler Walter and housekeeper Tanaja led the male and female servants, as well as the gardener and coachman, out. They stood on both sides to welcome their employer back. After he arrived in Desi Bay and bought the train tickets, Klein had sent a telegram back to Backlund, informing his butler when he was returning. However, he had instructed him not to send the coachman to pick him up at the station. After all, this was an era when steam locomotives were often delayed. It wasn't impossible that its arrival would be delayed to the next morning. Glancing at his servants who stood with a standard reverent pose, Klein secretly nodded and passed through them as he sighed inwardly. This does resemble the style of nobility. Even when the employer isn't around, the butler doesn't skive. When he arrived at the door, He nodded gently at Walter and Tanaja before saying, "It must have been hard on you while I was away." "It's our duty," Walter and Tanaja said with a bow. Klein then turned his gaze to his valet, Richardson. He realized that this good-looking mixed blood had a somewhat pale expression as he kept stealing glances at his employer's new valet, Anuni. Klein smirked inwardly as he nodded at him. "You did well. However, there's some business involving the southern continent that requires Anuni to handle it." "Oh yes, be Mr. Walter's assistant and help him in gathering information for a manor outside the city." "Assistant. Assistant butler." Richardson was first taken aback before he replied in pleasant surprise. "Yes, sir." With this role, it meant that he had broken free from the constraints of being a valet. He had been promoted. Walter didn't ask about the manor in detail as he seriously arranged for his employer settling in, bath, and meals. After all of this was done, he and Anuni sent Dwayne Dantes back to the third story before he asked, "Sir, do you plan on buying a manor in the suburbs of Backlund? What requirements do you have?" "Something not too expensive. Who knows how long I can use this identity for?" Klein inwardly gave a self-deprecating comment before deliberating. "One with a vineyard and brewery." After completing the arms deal, he had already established himself in Backlund's high society and had earned a huge sum of money. Therefore, it was necessary for him to own a manor. He couldn't afford to not be capable of inviting his friends on a vacation and hunt in the suburbs when autumn and winter came. This was a faux pas that could easily make him be viewed with scorn. Furthermore, the manors in Backlund's suburbs were rather expensive. One could purchase a huge manor with rubber trees in places like Desi Bay for £8,000 to £10,000. But here, all he wanted was a vineyard and grain farm, with facilities like a brewery. "I will gather the information as soon as possible," Walter replied respectfully. He knew his employer was exhausted from his traveling, so after briefly informing him of the recent developments, he left the third story and busied himself on other matters. With the new valet's help, Klein changed his clothes and washed up. During this process, Klein, who had gotten accustomed to his godhood, couldn't help but lampoon. "If it wasn't because a marionette cannot be more than 1,000 meters from me, would I have changed valets? Despite being a tycoon, I still have to serve myself." Sigh. Amidst his sighs, he dismissed Winner Anuni to the adjoining room and walked to the window. He looked at the lamplit Backlund, which resembled stars, as he allowed his thoughts to wander. "Next, my goal is MI9's Deputy Director, Brigadier General Conas Kilgore. As for the Captain of the Royal Guards, Viscount Stratford, I can leave him to the Demoness Trissy. She has vanished for quite some time. I wonder what he has been busy with. I wonder if she has come up with a way to approach that Viscount. I had previously informed her that I have other matters to tend to and wasn't free via the method she gave me. I'll later have to confirm that I'm free now and can continue our previous cooperation effort." After a while, Klein reined in his thoughts and got into bed. Without the help of cogitation, he fell deep asleep. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly opened his eyes and sensed that someone had entered 160 Backlund Street. Here it comes again. Klein couldn't help but raise his hand to rub his temples. On the first day of returning to Backlund, he had been awakened in the middle of the night. Chapter 976. Zealot dressed in pajamas. Klein didn't move. In his spiritual perception, the intruder's spirit body threads appeared. This also meant that if he so wished, he could turn everyone in 160 Backlund Street into his marionette without leaving the bed. Of course, to a demigod bizarro sorcerer, the neighbors a few buildings away were within range. There are many spirit bodies around. One of them is helping him fly. He has landed on the opposite balcony. Is it a beyonder from the death pathway, or the Evernight pathway? To be able to do this, he must at least be a sequence 6. He's here for Richardson? No, he's walking towards my bedroom. He has paused and has reached out his right hand to knock gently on my door. He's certain that I've detected him? Klein sat up with a slightly heavy expression. He had made the initial judgment via the spirit body threads, but subsequently, he did it via direct sight, a scene that formed in his mind. After Klein reached sequence 4, not only was his danger premonition as a clown enhanced, the amount of power he could stir and use from the mysterious space above the gray fog had experienced a qualitative boost. With the two combined, it wasn't difficult for him to use his intuition to have a projection of the intruder's figure and actions, despite the distance. In addition, due to his deepened control over the mysterious space, Klein could converge the augmentation effects the gray fog had on him in the real world. This prevented Beyonders of certain pathways from seeing anything. Based on his judgment, by being above the gray fog, augmenting himself with a card of blasphemy, and using the sea god scepter, the strength that the fool could direct at the real world was asymptotically closer to that of an angel. If that weren't the case, even if the gray fog and the paper figurine substitutes could allow others to maintain their lucidity in dreamlike states, Klein wouldn't have dared to allow Miss Justice to face a Sequence 4 or even Sequence 3 of the spectator pathway. Amidst his thoughts, he left his bed, wore his slippers, and straightened his pajamas. He walked to the reclining chair and leisurely sat down. "Please come in." The door to the master bedroom opened silently, but no cold wind blew in. All it did was spiral in the corridor. The visitor was a man about Dwayne Dantes' age, and of similar height. He had black hair and brown eyes. He had cut facial features, a classic example of a Loanese man. He wore a silk top hat and had a rather thin face. His demeanor was cold but wasn't one that left others feeling uncomfortable. Instead, it was a manifestation of the night view at a suburban cemetery. At this instant, Klein saw countless spirit bodies hugging a middle-aged gentleman. It made his surroundings dark and stacked, as though a world was hidden within. Klein's spiritual intuition told him that this was a demigod. Why would there be a demigod coming to me moments after I arrive back in Backlund? Apart from the Church of Evernight's Backlund Archbishop, nothing has been exposed in regards to this identity as Dwayne Dantes. Having a headache, Klein looked at the door without an expression. It was unknown whether he was feeling angry or alarmed. After taking 2 steps, the demigod's right hand suddenly hung down straight. Together with his waist, it bent like a bow pulled to its limit. He had bowed deeply in a strange manner, his attitude extremely reverent. Meanwhile, a cold wind blew over, closing the door silently. Klein was nearly taken aback, feeling at a loss. His mind whirred as he came to a rough guess. At this moment, the demigod maintained his pose and said in a deep voice, "In response to a revelation, I, Patrick Bryan of the Numinous Episcopate, am here to meet your excellency." Revelation. Klein controlled the twitching of his facial muscles. Together with his previous guess, he had a rough understanding of what was happening. The Evernight goddess had deepened her control of artificial death, in other words, the death pathway's uniqueness. She was able to give revelations to the high-ranking members of the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Klein sighed as he chuckled. He pressed his right hand to his chest, but he didn't make any additional movements. What is God's revelation? Bryan slowly stood straight and looked at the gentleman with the white sideburns sitting at the reclining chair. He replied with some level of fervor, "We succeeded. God has finally awakened. He has requested me to listen to your commands from this day forth, and to follow your arrangements." Klein had already expected this, but he felt his face burn, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "This is making me be a blessed of Evernight while also part-timing as a blessed of artificial death, so as to silently lead the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. Is this a bestowment of fate, or a price that had been exacted?" Since the goddess didn't get the church's archbishops or high-ranking deacons to handle this matter, it means that she wishes it to be kept confidential. Klein instantly stood up and tried to appear pious in tone and expression. "As God's revelation commands. God's wish is my wish." After expressing his devotion, he looked at the demigod standing straight in front of him and pointed to the sofa opposite him. "Please have a seat. Oh, do introduce yourself. That's the most basic form of politeness, isn't it?" Moments ago, as the thoughts ran through his mind, Klein had vaguely grasped the reason why the goddess had handed him leadership over the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction. As Gehrman Sparrow, he had close connections with the Death Consul. Therefore, if anyone were to really discover anything amiss and begin investigating the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction, they would realize that it had something to do with Gehrman Sparrow and be enlightened. They would believe that they had grasped the truth as to why artificial death was able to come to life and send a revelation. Due to this guess, Klein deliberately made Dantes use Gehrman Sparrow's usual speech. Patrick Bryan sat on the sofa and said after some thought, "I'm Loanese. I once did business in East Balham and nearly died because of a disease. I was rescued by members of the Numinous Episcopate, and during that ritual, I received God's grace and survived. Later I secretly changed my faith. The faction I'm in is always being vilified by the other members of the Numinous Episcopate. They believe that we're engaging in sacrilege, that we're in a bid to create a new death. But that's not the case. We firmly believe that God didn't perish at the end of the fourth epoch. He is merely asleep and requires certain things to be done in order to awaken. The facts have proven that we were right. You are witness to this. The ancient chronicles I received didn't say so. Those high-ranking members of the numinous episcopate are fully aware that they are emulating the matter of the hidden sage to create artificial death. Could it be that this gentleman in front of me isn't a core member of the numinous episcopate's artificial death faction? And he also lacks sufficient knowledge regarding the uniqueness? But how can a demigod not be a core member? Even if the numinous episcopate is a remnant of the Balaam royal family and Death's church, with copious amounts of knowledge and powerhouses, there's no way they will let a demigod go to waste. Even the 7 Orthodox churches wouldn't do such a thing. Klein was extremely puzzled hearing this as he asked, "What about the other high-ranking members of your faction?" Patrick Bryan said with a reverent look, "When I joined the numinous episcopate, God had already awakened a little. This is all the work of the saints of the past. They had sacrificed themselves over the numerous rituals. Currently, we have a total of 3 saints and an angel. They are in East Balaam while I'm in charge of Backland matters." That's not right. Based on the information provided by Leonard, the numinous episcopate have their members split into many small teams in Backland. They aren't aware of each other, and they only make contact with a specific person in the southern continent. There's no overall person in charge. Klein's first reaction was that Patrick Bryan was lying, but he immediately dismissed it. This was because it was something easily verifiable for a blessed who had been the focus of a revelation. He thought for a moment before he asked, "What's that angel's name? Where is he? Are there any other revelations?" Patrick Bryan answered frankly, "God made me not inform others, nor make inquiries to others about matters. Our leader's name is Hater, both a last name and first name. He was once the archbishop of the church, and later he became an angel thanks to God's grace. He has always been working hard to awaken the sleeping God, but he was severely corrupted in one of the rituals. Currently, he is unable to leave his mausoleum. Otherwise, he would directly lose control. He is considered my teacher. This demigod that has existed since the Balaam Empire is clearly key in steering the artificial death project." Klein asked in thought, "He and the other 2 demigods are Balamese purebloods?" "Yes." Patrick Bryan nodded. "I roughly get what's happening." Klein couldn't help but sigh inwardly. He believed that Patrick Bryan wasn't an ordinary demigod, but a byproduct of the artificial death project. Back then, Hater and the other members of the numinous episcopate's artificial death faction had no intention of saving Aloanese. Instead, they had planned on using him for a ritual sacrificial item or material. In the end, something unexpected happened during their attempt which they originally hadn't had high hopes of. Death's uniqueness gained some level of instinct or produced other changes. This led to Patrick Bryan's survival and his establishment of a certain connection with artificial death. His spirit and body became special. Upon witnessing this, Hater and the other high-ranking members began viewing Patrick Bryan as key to the success of the artificial death project. They gave him potions and taught him, proselytizing him with the faith of death, thus fabricating a perfect excuse for themselves. And due to Bryan's specialness, he had advanced rapidly and became a demigod. Of course, no matter how key he was merely an experimental subject. Patrick Bryan had never been treated as one of the members of the numinous episcopate's artificial death faction. Later, he was sent to the Lone Kingdom's Backland to lead 2 or 3 teams. He did various kinds of rituals in a bid to bring the uniqueness alive. Such a guess was in line with the situation which Klein was currently aware of. First, Leonard had mentioned that the numinous episcopate's artificial death faction had placed their experiments in Backland, planning to destroy the enemy's capital even if an accident happened. Second, many teams were independently connected to the southern continent and Backland and had no overall person in charge. Third, Patrick Bryan's knowledge of artificial death was very different from reality. This also meant that the people in the southern continent didn't care for Bryan's life and death, nor did they tell him the truth. Under such circumstances, there was no other explanation unless he was a byproduct of the artificial death project. From the looks of it, the goddess's control of the uniqueness is still limited. She can only send revelations to one person who is directly connected to artificial death. She is unable to influence Hater and the other saints. Klein reined in his thoughts and asked, "What's your current sequence?" Patrick Bryan didn't hide the truth. I'm an undying. Chapter 977 First Sermon. Klein wasn't surprised at Patrick Bryan's answer. He nodded gently and said, "Which incarnation number are you at?" Based on what he knew, undying died once every 60 years before reviving. They would then lose most of their memories, which needed to be slowly recollected. It was like the beginning of a new life. This was knowledge that came from the potion, so Patrick Bryan easily understood what the blessed meant. He deliberated over his words and said, "I'm not 50 yet. I haven't been an undying for more than 10 years. Klein then asked, "When did you switch faiths to our Lord?" Here, Lord, referred to the Lord of the underworld. Bryan recalled for 2 to 3 seconds before he said, "I had just celebrated my 30th birthday back then." Stepping into the world of mystery at 30 and becoming a beyonder. Becoming a sequence 4 demigod before 40. This speed either means shocking talent or that he's a blessed. Indeed, his spirit and body had been influenced by the death pathway's uniqueness during that ritual. As Klein listened, he became more certain of his theories from before. Of course, compared to how he had only taken a year to go from an ordinary person to a sequence 4 demigod, Patrick Bryan's advancement speed was nothing on this point. Klein didn't feel that there was anything to be poignant about, because he was truly a blessed. Furthermore, he had cheats far greater than one. The only problem was that he wasn't sure if everything that he had done was enough to exchange for something. After some thought, Klein asked, "What's your current public identity?" "I'm a businessman. I have 2 garment factories in Backlund. On the surface, I believe in the Evernight goddess and am a supporter of the new party." Patrick Bryan introduced himself. Klein nearly let out a scoff as he continued, "How many numinous episcopate members do you have under you? What are they doing?" Already prepared, Bryan answered eloquently, 2 teams, a total of 12 beyonders. Some of them are working at my garment factory while others are in the watch and clock industry. All of them have their own formal occupations. Typically, they will be careful when proselytizing to the people around them. The progress on this is very slow, nor is it the main goal. We do not have more than 100 believers. Most of the time, they are searching for clues that God had left behind, as well as the different materials needed for the awakening ritual. With clues in hand, we will carry out operations. And once the materials are gathered, we will experiment in different awakening rituals and seek out the most effective one. I'm the main person behind this operation, and am also core to the rituals. You sound pretty proud of that. Klein asked about other matters and received detailed answers. Finally, he thought for a moment before saying with a stern expression, "In accordance with the revelation from God, you are to heed my instructions from this moment forth." Patrick Bryan immediately got up and gave a solemn bow. "Yes, Your Excellency." Klein nodded slightly and answered, "First, stop all rituals and stop gathering materials. God has already partially awakened. He is in his recovery stage, so he isn't to be disturbed by noise." From Klein's point of view, regardless of the changes in Bryan's awakening rituals, they were ultimately pointed at artificial death, the death pathway's uniqueness. This would only increase its chances of coming to life, making it disadvantageous for the goddess to deepen her control over it. And regardless if Klein was happy for this to happen or not, since the Evernight goddess had assigned Bryan to him, he had to make such arrangements. Patrick Bryan had zero doubts toward his explanation, because death had indeed awoken, and awakening rituals were, in essence, a form of disturbance. This undying thought before asking, "Your Excellency, what should we do next?" Klein smiled with approbation. "Continue seeking out clues for things that God left behind. This will aid in his recovery." Upon saying that, Klein originally had a second request, but he was worried that there were too few clues to it, making it possible for the numinous episcopate members to stir up trouble with nothing to be done. He added, "In addition, promote reading to all those around you and your subordinates, be it at the garment factory or elsewhere. Establish night schools or learning classes. Let the people around you extricate themselves from ignorance and savagery." To make it more convincing, Klein stretched out his right hand and pressed it to his chest. With abnormal piousness, he began preaching. God said one needs to understand the belief to believe. God said that to those who are lost, one has to first strengthen their body and arm his brain. This is because the kingdom he promises is one without ignorance and savagery. Patrick Bryan didn't doubt Dwayne Dantes' words, Nor did he find it strange that such records weren't found in the Numinous Episcopate's Bible. This was because this person before him was God's blessed, a representative appointed by God. He earnestly nodded. I will heed God's teachings. May every spirit gain eternal life in God's kingdom. As he said that, he used the praying gesture that the Numinous Episcopate's artificial death faction used. It was to raise both hands high, thumbs facing each other as he held them at his forehead. In mysticism theory, this was the core to the underworld contained in every gatekeeper. It represented death's position. Klein returned with the same gesture and words before saying, Second, orders from the southern continent, no matter who it comes from, has to be handed to me first. They can be done only after I give permission. If no permission is given, you are not to do it in private. You can only give feedback based on what I say. This was because he was worried that Hater, the angel of the death domain, would still remain fervent about the artificial death plan, occasionally instructing Brian and the others to make new attempts. Meanwhile, he also had to ensure that Hater and the other two saints wouldn't notice anything amiss before the goddess gained a deeper control over the death pathway's uniqueness. He needed to prevent them from doing anything excessive. Brian had no objections on this matter. Yes, Your Excellency. After giving instructions on the two most important matters, Klein wore the same expression, but he inwardly felt relieved. He said after some deliberation, Third, unless convened by me, do not seek me out. Our usual communications shall be completed via messengers. As you know, there are many existences in the astral world who do not wish to see God return. Patrick Brian nodded heavily. I understand. My messenger's summoning incantation is, Spirit wandering above the world, absolutely friendly creature, Patrick Brian's contract companion. Indeed, it's impossible for a demigod of the death pathway to not have a messenger. Normally, Sequence 6 Beyonders of this pathway should have one. Klein didn't hesitate as he answered in an unhurried tone. Remember, my messenger's summoning incantation is, the spirit that wanders about the unfounded, the friendly creature that can be subordinated, the messenger that belongs to Gehrman Sparrow. Oh, be it receiving or sending mail, a gold coin needs to be paid to complete the transaction. Klein deliberately revealed that Gehrman Sparrow and Dwayne Dantes were related, in order to determine Brian's reaction. Gehrman Sparrow. Patrick Brian repeated the name in puzzlement before coming to an enlightened state. He exclaimed in pleasant surprise, Your Excellency, Death Consul? Thankfully, although he's a byproduct of a ritual and is fervently zealous, he has normal intelligence. He can consciously seek out information and do an analysis. Klein exhaled in relief and replied with a smile, I'm not him. He is my teacher. Brian nodded in thought, believing that he had fully understood the entire matter. Klein guessed at his thoughts but ignored it. Crossing his right leg, he placed both hands on his knee and asked, What do you know about the other factions of the Numinous Episcopate? Patrick Brian sat down again and said, The Numinous Episcopate's strongest faction is the royal family faction. With God's descendants as the core, they have established many organizations. Their leader is currently a descendant with a relatively thin bloodline. Her name is Sia Palenque Eggers. She might be an angel or wields an important relic of God. She calls herself Pale White Empress. Other than her, the royal family faction had 5 other saint apostles. Some of them are true demigods, while others rely on sealed artifacts. Other than the royal family faction and us, the other factions are relatively weaker. The main ones are the Repose faction and the Underworld faction. Only by working together do they have 3 powerful Beyonders who are equivalent to the Saint Apostles. After Brian finished, Klein nodded indiscernibly. That's it for today. If there's anything in the future, feel free to contact me. Yes, Your Excellency. Patrick Brian stood up and bowed before leaving the room. The door silently opened as the figure outside slinked into the shadows and disappeared with the cold wind. After everything calmed down, Klein glanced at the door that had closed. He walked to the window, drew the curtains, and looked towards the street. There were a few carriages there at some point in time. Each of them had 2 lanterns hanging in front of them. Their lights were abnormally pale white with a tinge of dark green. They illuminated the surroundings into a blur. Nearly transparent figures surrounded this blurry scene. They were wearing illusory clothes that appeared like formal wear, making them appear rather formal. After Patrick Brian landed from midair and returned,
The figures bowed and attentively followed the demigod and the spirit beside him onto the hardly visible carriages.
Then, they steered into the distance. The pale white light with tinges of dark green grew faint and finally vanished into the darkness as though it had never arrived. Klein looked away and muttered to himself with a solemn expression. Although the revelation received by Patrick Bryan stems from the goddess and her considerations, I have a nagging feeling that there's something dark and sinister about to break out in Backland or even the entire world. I wonder when it will stir up some waves. With this in mind, Klein didn't delay a second. He immediately contacted Demoness Trissy to confirm that nothing abnormal had happened to her. Chapter 978 Gift on a night with clear moonlight. In the garden of 160 Buckland Street. A grey rat crawled out of its hole, running straight for the master bedroom's bed. As a tiny black, glue-like blob object floated down, the rat held it over its head like an acrobatic act. It quickly turned around, ran out of 160 Buckland Street, and headed for the sewer entrance. At this moment, the grey rat raised its torso up and reached out with two of its paws. They magically extended as blobs of flesh appeared on its forelimbs. Then, using its mutated front paws, it moved the manhole cover away without causing a sound. Without stopping at all, the grey rat headed straight down the sewers, going all the way to the spot where Demoness Trissy previously hid. It kept digging in a corner until it excavated a mirror fragment from the soil. Having done that, the grey rat threw the black sticky object over its head to the side where it was relatively clean. It then retreated to a corner, allowing its body to stretch and turn into a middle-aged man wearing a dark red coat and a triangular hat. He was none other than Admiral of Blood, who had previously been active at sea. However, this seigneur, along with his clothes and body, was just a thin layer, akin to a figurine cut from paper. This rat is quite fat. Admiral of Blood stroked his chin, but his paper figurine-like body nearly flew up as a result of the cold draft in the sewers. The person who spoke was none other than Klein. He was inside his master bedroom, turning a rat into his marionette by controlling its spirit body threads. He then made it carry the ritual materials and head down the sewers to contact Demoness Trissy. Seigneur, whose arms were flailing about due to the draft, bent down and picked up the sticky blob. This was the remains of Trissy's lock of hair after she burned it with black flames. It could be used for a communication ritual. Right on the heels of that, he wiped the mirror fragment clean and smeared the material onto it. After this step, Klein made his marionette take 2 steps back from the mirror. With a smacking sound, Seigneur was plastered to the mossy wall like an oil painting East Borough. In a room with thick curtains that left it almost dark. Raven black, slimy tentacles coiled together, forming a huge sphere. And at the end of these tentacles, there were either eyes with clear blacks and whites embedded in them, or there were venomous snake heads attached there. The latter opened their mouths slightly as they shot out their tongues in a rather strange fashion. It was quite a harrowing scene. Suddenly, they flailed up or retracted as the sphere crumbled, layer after layer. Enveloped in the middle of a sphere was a curled-up girl. She had abnormally sweet looks, but her brows were tightly furrowed. Her expression looked slightly warped due to the pain, a look that stirred up one's sense of pity. Reaching out her right hand, she tapped on the mirror's surface. The black flames burst before disappearing, restoring the full-body mirror to normal. In the sewers, Seigneur buried the mirror fragment back into the soil and made his body shrink rapidly, turning back into a grey rat. It then ran deep into the sewers, allowing itself to be fed by carnivores. Back in 160 Buckland Street, Klein drew his curtains and returned to the reclining chair. To be frank, he regretted cooperating with Trissy. He felt that she was burdened by some will of the primordial demoness and was reckless for revenge. She was like a ticking bomb that might explode at any moment. If Trissy were to mutate, it's highly possible that she would create a terrifying disaster. I shouldn't have spared her back then. Klein sighed and began setting up a ritual. He sent the black blob above the grey fog and attempted to divination Trissy's present location and recent condition. 20 to 30 seconds later, he was met with failure. This only worried him more because such an outcome implied that Trissy had become a blessed of the primordial demoness to a certain extent. The next afternoon, Klein, who had had breakfast, began instructing butler Walter and the newly appointed butler assistant, Richardson, to deliver the gifts he had brought from the southern continent. This filled an entire luggage bag, of which included Fermo coffee beans, East Balham tobacco, River Valley's grape wine, and human bone sculptures. They were to be gifted to the different neighbors around the neighborhood as a sign of goodwill from Dwayne Dantes. It was also to announce his return to the social scene. Oh yes, remember to mention to Member of Parliament Mocked or his wife that this bottle of River Valley grape wine is suitable for making cocktails. It's best matched with lemon juice, Klein exhorted Walter. Particular care was needed in gifting others. It had to take into account the receiver's preferences, and obviously, the most popular product of the southern continent at present, Donningsman Hair Tonic, wasn't suitable as a gift, as it would only appear to be a veiled attempt at ridicule.
Walter solemnly nodded and said, "Yes, sir."
After receiving no more instructions from his employer, Richardson glanced at the remaining pile of gifts and asked, "Where will they be sent to?" "This is for the staff of the Bursary Foundation." "I'll deliver it myself," Klein said with a smile. He then pointed at the golden amulet in his hand and said, "I missed the birth of Dr. Aaron's child, so I'll need to express my apologies in person. Haha, I'll head over in the afternoon and plan on gifting this amulet with southern continent characteristics to that child. Of course, as a baby, Willa Septon series probably won't like it. Compared to this, I'll just call him he would rather have ice cream." Klein grumbled inwardly after answering Richardson. After the butler and Richardson left, bringing gifts and male servants to the different neighbors, Klein got into his carriage and headed straight for the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation at 22 Phelps Street. After alighting, he headed forward with his valet, Anuni, carrying plenty of gifts behind him. Along the way, he greeted and gifted any members of the staff he saw. Soon, Klein arrived at the second story and arrived at one of the director's office. He knocked gently on the door. "Please come in." Audrey Hall's gentle voice sounded. As a rather senior spectator, she had already noticed that Mr. Dwayne Dantes had come to the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation. She had been patiently waiting for him. Klein pushed the door and entered, taking out a small gift box from his inner pocket before saying with a warm smile, "I've returned from the southern continent. Well, my business went very smoothly. I brought some gifts for everyone, hoping to share my happiness with everyone." He had specially mentioned this to indicate to Miss Justice that he remembered her request. "You leave me no reason to decline it," Audrey said with an expectant smile. This didn't mean that she cared for the gift Mr. World gave, but more a result of being curious as to what Mr. World would give. After receiving the gift box, she tore open the wrapping in front of Dwayne Dantes and discovered an accessory with a white feather adorned with pale yellow patterns as its highlight. "This is a decorative ribbon," Klein explained. "People of certain social standing in East Balham will enjoy wearing items with such white feathers on various parts of their body. Out of all the places, it's considered most noble and meaningful to attach it to a hat. This is said to be a tradition from the worship of feathered serpents." "Haha, feathered serpents are symbols for death over there." And the feather he got a southern continent craftsman to craft into the hat was a byproduct of the Artificial Death Project. It could be sacrificed. Klein had once obtained 3 of them. He had used one in Byam by using the copper whistle messenger and summoning the mutated monster which was corrupted by artificial death. The other was sacrificed to artificial death in the southern continent, allowing him to receive the revelation of Nzangwil being possessed by an evil spirit. This was the last feather. As the present artificial death was equivalent to the Evernight goddess to a certain extent, Klein, who was clearly a blessed, didn't need to carry out such acts in subsequent rituals. He could use other materials to replace the feather, so he decided to turn the remaining one into a gift for Miss Justice. After all, she was also a believer of Evernight, and she might be able to contact artificial death at some critical moment. Audrey held her present with a smile as she silently listened to Dwayne Dantes's description. For some baffling reason, an idea flashed in her mind. Don't tell me Mr. World really plucked a feathered serpent's feather for this hat. Chapter 979 Joy of Life. The traditions in the southern continent are really different from ours. Audrey looked down at the feathered cap in the gift box as she marveled, but it's in line with my taste. The latter half of her sentence was partially genuine and partially out of politeness. On the one hand, she found the processed feather akin to a piece of artwork, and on the other hand, she found its style too obvious and extreme. It wasn't something she would use as an accessory. This was akin to how others would have their interest piqued by items with unique and mysterious patterns when visiting ancient ruins. They would be filled with praise over it, but they would seldom purchase similar items to place it at home or use it as an accessory. Klein smiled in response. There are also many stark differences amongst the southern continent traditions. It's almost completely different in East Balam from the highlands and river valley. Of course, they also have their similarities such as their adoration of gold. They believe that this metal possesses magical powers. As he said that, he pointed at the feather in Audrey's hand. Legend has it that people who wear such accessories would receive the blessings of the feathered serpent, or in other words, death. He was hinting to Audrey about how she could use the feather. As a sequence 6 of the spectator pathway, Audrey easily read in between the lines. She understood that the hat accessory allowed her to receive a response from the so-called death at critical moments, bringing about certain effects. As for how she should use it, it was basic knowledge in mysticism. Audrey had a solid foundation and didn't require Mr. Dwayne Dantes to explain in detail. She faintly smiled without revealing her teeth and said, "I really like it. I will attach it to my hat in appropriate situations." Not bad. It's so easy talking to spectators. Klein returned with a smile and pointed at the door. "I still have presents to hand out." "You will be the most welcomed person here today," Audrey replied with a smile, a euphemistic way of expressing her gratitude. Meanwhile, she was a little vexed. She was hesitant about finding an opportunity to inform Mr. World, who had been embroiled in Quarren's suicide, about Vin Rambus. He had shown some deep interest and importance on the matter. "Oh, it's almost Monday. I'll leave it until the tarot gathering. It will be much easier to communicate when the time comes. I can also seek advice from Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit on how to deal with my current situation, especially the problem of being wary against the cues and hypnotism from a high-sequence beyonder. After all, I can't always pray to Mr. Fool ahead of time to receive an angel's blessing. On careful thought, such a form of hypnotism is truly terrifying. Carrying out instructions without realizing it." Audrey's mind was awash with thoughts as they bubbled. This made her suspect that many people in Baklan's high society had been hypnotized, acting in ways that violated their true intentions and will. In addition, she also came to realize something. Every time her parents attended Mass at St. Samuel Cathedral, the one in charge of the rites was definitely Baklan's archbishop. And to hold such a post, he was definitely a demigod of the Church of Evernight. At times, His Grace will even visit in person to chat with us. This is to prevent such matters from happening? That's why Vin Rambis's hypnosis effect on me didn't go overboard? Audrey watched as Dwayne Dantes left her office. After closing the door and sitting down at her desk, she picked up a fountain pen and mindlessly scribbled on it. After she reined in her thoughts, the piece of white paper was filled with interlocking circles. There was a face with cold eyes and scattered lines. At a glance, Audrey tensed up. She immediately used her spirituality and the friction between items to ignite the paper, turning it to ashes. Her random drawing had, in a sense, reflected her true emotions and thoughts. And to a good psychiatrist, interpreting such pictures was a basic skill. Therefore, Audrey hadn't left any traces behind. After a while, Klein delivered all his gifts and chatted with a few directors along the way. Finally, he entered a room meant for part-time directors like him to rest. He found a pen and paper, sat on the sofa, and began writing after some thought. "Dear Mr. Azek, while in the southern continent, Klein had written about Adam's obtaining of 0-08. His successful revenge on Zangwill with the help of Leonard and Daly. He then summoned the messenger via the copper whistle, and sent it to the sleeping Mr. Azek. Without a doubt, he had yet to receive a reply to date. Klein wasn't worried about mentioning Adam and 0-08 in the letter, because the Angel of Imagination definitely knew about his relationship with Mr. Azek. And sharing matters he encountered with someone familiar wouldn't garner any excessive reaction. This time, Klein's letter didn't involve anything extraordinary. With a smile and gentle scribble, he shared the details about the Bursary Foundation which he learned from Audrey and the other directors. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "This is a really meaningful matter. I feel satisfied and happy about it. Mr. Azek, would you feel the same? When you awaken, perhaps you can attempt to do something similar. Every time you revive, you would be able to see the children who had received your help in the past. When that happens, although they might not remember them, they will definitely remember you." After finishing the letter and putting down the fountain pen, Klein carefully read it once, and after confirming that there weren't any problems, he blew the copper whistle, summoned the skeleton messenger, and allowed it to take the letter away. Following that, He left the Lone Charity Bursary Foundation with his valet, Anuni. He came to the nearby St. Samuel Cathedral and silently prayed for 15 minutes in the serene and dark prayer hall. Like before, Klein came to the donation box and threw a stack of cash in, a total of £80. Taking this opportunity, he found Bishop Electra and had a chat with him and listened to his sermon. This also announced to the church of Dwayne Dantes's return. As for presents, Klein didn't directly give it since he was inside the goddess's cathedral. Instead, Butler Walter would naturally deliver his gifts to the bishop's residences in private. At tea time in the afternoon, Klein followed his schedule and left 160 Buckland Street and headed to Dr. Aaron's for a visit. Richardson had already informed them in the morning and had received permission to visit. This time, Klein not only met Dr. Aaron Series, but he also met his wife, Wilma Gladys, as well as the newborn and his elder brothers and sisters who were a few years older. What a pity that I wasn't able to participate in. Klein deliberated, paused and successfully waited for Wilma Gladys to reply, Will with a smile. He reorganized his words and said, Unfortunately, I was unable to participate in Will's birthday party because of my trip to East Balham. This is an amulet that's rather popular over there. It brings children good luck. As he said that, he handed the golden accessory to Dr. Aaron. Aaron Series wasn't a man who was good with words. He accepted it without declining it and nodded. Thank you. Following that, he held the string and hung the golden amulet into the pram beside him. Shaking it, he asked, Will, do you like it? Wrapped in silver silk, the chubby baby raised his arm, swung it, and flicked the golden amulet away. Flicked away. The mood instantly turned a little awkward in the activity room. Klein chuckled and broke the silence. This is a reaction all kids have. At this moment, a maid had delivered the 3-layered tray for high tea, allowing the hosts and the guests to switch topics of conversation, allowing the mood to return to normal. As Klein drank his black tea and ate the pastry, he began talking about all kinds of interesting customs in East and West Balham. It left the couple and their 2 other children intrigued as they would question him from time to time. During this process, Klein suddenly turned to face the pram and asked with a smile, You don't seem to enjoy my present? As he spoke, nothing abnormal happened to the couple and the rest of the people in the activity room as they continued wearing attentive looks. In the illusion Klein created, he hadn't finished his recount. Willa Septon, who had fleshy arms, scoffed as he said with a childlike voice, What's the point in having such gifts? You might as well give me gwater. At the very least that can be drunk. Klein smiled as he shook his head and said, I have some news for you. Chapter 980 Choice of Parasitic Target. After some placating, Aaron Series and Wilma Gladys finally managed to calm down the baby. Phew. The thin and tall Aaron heaved a sigh of relief and got up. Nudging his gold-rimmed glasses, he nodded at his guest with an apologetic look. After organizing his words for a few seconds, he said, Sorry about that. Children are often like this. Indeed. Klein smiled in reply, indicating that he didn't mind it one bit. Following that, he changed the topic of conversation and continued sharing his experiences in East and West Balham. During this process, he made use of his beyonder powers once more, making everyone in the activity room fall under the effects of an illusion. Then, he picked up the ice cream which he hadn't finished, changed the spoon and got up with a smile. Walking to the pram, he asked gently, Will, do you want some? Without waiting for the chubby fellow wrapped in silver silk to reply, he said with a gentle tone, You're born now and should be able to fold a paper crane. This way, I don't have to visit often. You should know how suspicious it is. Willa Septon Series glared at him without giving him a reply. Klein didn't flinch as he took out a piece of high-quality paper and placed it in the pram. Then he bent down, scooping out some ice cream. A price is always exacted for what fate bestows, isn't it? Klein chuckled as he swished the spoon in his hand. In the pram, Will raised his left hand, wiping the tears that hadn't dried from his face, and mumbled, For beyonders of the fate pathway, the exacted price needs to be paid first before awaiting bestowment. With that said, the chubby baby grabbed the piece of paper and folded a paper crane with great difficulty. Klein stood in front of the pram and maintained the stability of the spoon, watching this scene with a smile. A carriage set off from Pinster Street and headed for St. Samuel Cathedral. While passing by 160 Buckland Street, Leonard Mitchell looked out the window and seemingly muttered to himself, Dwayne Dantes is back as well. The slightly aged voice rang out in his mind, Fate will ultimately intertwine. Old man, you're becoming more of a charlatan after you woke up. Leonard couldn't help but mock. Pallas Zoros chuckled without a reply. After coming to St. Samuel Cathedral, Leonard entered the study of Backlund's Archbishop, St. Anthony, under a priest's lead. Anthony Stevenson was wearing a black robe with red hues.
His eyes were deep and his face clean-shaven.
Standing by a cupboard, the shadow created seemed like an unknown existence that observed everything from the darkness. It stirred fear into anyone.
"Your Grace, you summoned me?"
Although Leonard had already anticipated it, he still bowed in a rather lacking manner.
Anthony nodded gently and said, "You have already rendered enough services to apply to become a Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock.
However, you haven't finished digesting the Soul Assura potion. Therefore, I'll be extracting you out of Soast's team and assigning you some separate missions."
Leonard replied as per protocol, "I am at your command."
Anthony picked up a stack of papers on his desk and said, "These are cases with suspected paranormal activity. You are to investigate each case, mainly placating or purifying them. If you require additional assistance, you can select members from the Nighthawks team of each area of jurisdiction."
"Yes, Your Grace."
Leonard would have done similar tasks even if St. Anthony hadn't instructed him to do so. Therefore, he had zero objections towards such an assignment.
After receiving the stack of papers, he casually flipped through it and said, "Your Grace, what's Captain Soast's team busy with at present?"
He had been focused on revenge over the past half-year, making himself appear desultory and insular. This prevented him from building strong friendships with the Red Gloves teammates, but despite that, they were teammates who he had fought alongside with. He couldn't help but be concerned for them. "They have been assigned to help Crestet finish a mission." Anthony Stevenson didn't answer in detail. "His Excellency Sesamir is also in Backlund." Leonard didn't ask further as he gestured 4 points across his chest in a clockwise fashion.
"May the goddess bless everyone. Praise the lady."
Anthony did the same gesture. After leaving the Archbishop's study, Leonard headed down to the basement. He wanted to find a quiet room and list down his upcoming mission and run through them in the assigned order. Midway while walking down the stairs, he subconsciously looked at the stained windows above him. The sunlight was shining in, making the artwork made from the stained windows look even more solemn. It also accentuated the tiny bugs and dust that floated in midair. Upon seeing this scene, Leonard suddenly recalled Old Man's description of Amon. He had the inexplicable feeling that the blasphemer was everywhere. He trembled inwardly as a thought came to him. He quickly asked with a suppressed voice, "Old man, I have a question."
"What is it?"
Pallas Zoros asked slowly. Leonard asked with a suppressed voice, "Back then, why didn't you parasitize a bug? They're smaller and more concealed. You can easily hide in cathedrals without being worried that Amon would discover you. How long can a bug live? Continuously switching parasitic targets is extremely burdensome on the body. This way, not only will recovery not be possible by parasitizing it, but it will even worsen one's condition and shorten one's lifespan," Pallas Zoros triumphed and said.
Leonard was somewhat enlightened as he pressed, "What about other creatures?"
"Those that live relatively longer lives and can enter a cathedral without being noticed."
Pallas Zoros immediately chortled before saying, "From the looks of it, you haven't kept what I've said to heart."
"This will only serve to make you suffer in the future. The higher the sequence is, the greater the inclinations towards losing control is, and the more madness accumulates. This is a trait of the characteristics, and it can only be resisted and suppressed. There's no way to eliminate it. Therefore, for a parasite, choosing a target for parasitizing requires one to consider these aspects. If one were to parasitize ordinary animals, it's still all right for short periods of time. But once it goes on for too long, one will suffer the effects of the body's construct and hormones. Heh, everything is reciprocal, isn't it? A parasite can influence the target, but so can the target influence a parasite. When one parasitizes an ordinary animal, it's necessary to frequently talk to someone to avoid forgetting one's former identity. This way, the chances of exposure is extremely high, and if one doesn't do that, the host will definitely influence the parasite, causing them to lose the ability to speak. It will muddle one's own existence until one doesn't know he is. It would then result in madness and with the loss of control crushing the parasite." Leonard was left alarmed as he nodded slightly. "I understand. It's no wonder you are so strict on choosing a parasitic target." Are you trying to praise yourself? Palaz Zoroastsked. To us, the best parasitic target is undoubtedly beyonders of the same pathway. All aspects will be synchronized, and by nurturing them one sequence at a time, they can be made as replenishments for one's beyonder powers. It would be the best medicine and a potential option for taking over the body. Upon hearing old man speak of such vile and terrifying matters so calmly, Leonard frowned slightly as he secretly heaved a sigh of relief. This meant that old man wouldn't do the same to him. Palaz Zoroast continued, the second best choice would be beyonders from the seer or apprentice pathways. The absorption of their powers wouldn't incur too much a burden on the parasite, allowing them to quickly recover. The next choice would then be smart beyonders of other pathways. At the very least, communication would be good and cooperation would be possible. As for you, hee. Leonard was just about to retort old man when he suddenly saw a bishop walking down from above. He hurriedly shut his mouth, held onto the railings and sped up his pace. 7:30 in the evening, 39 Buckland Street. Member of Parliament Mock's house. Dressed in a tailcoat, Klein got off a carriage as he buttoned his clothes. Under the lit fountain's illumination, he entered the foyer and met Maury Mocht, who was dressed in an olive-green military uniform with an orange-red sash across his waist. His chest was covered with medals, accolades of his achievements in war. His wife, Rihanna, was wearing a shoulder-exposing dress. She greeted Dwayne Dantes with a smile. Welcome, our traveler. Everyone has been waiting for you to share your experiences at Balam this time. Should I launch a travel column at a newspaper company? Klein replied with a joke. Mocht knew that Dwayne Dantes had headed for Southern Continent to do business. Furthermore, it was a business he kick-started. Therefore, after exchanging a smile, he came close and gave him a hug, suppressing his voice by saying, "Well done." Klein smiled with a nod and asked, "Do you like the present?" He was referring to the bottle of River Valley grape wine that could be made into a sour cocktail. "It was excellent. I still fondly recall the taste," Mocht said earnestly. Klein was about to enter the hall when he noticed something amiss. He did a cursory glance and asked out of puzzlement, "Miss Hazel isn't in? Has she been sent to study at an all-girls public school?" Rihanna sighed as she shook her head. "No, she's only sick. She'll head for public school only in September." "She caught a cold?" Klein expressed the concern a guest should have. Mocht said with a helpless smile, "No, she was bitten by a rabid rat when she was at the manor in the outskirts. Her wound hasn't healed completely yet." Hazel got bitten by a rabid rat. Klein nodded in thought. "Did she see a doctor?" "Oh, has that rat been caught?" "The doctor gave her an injection to prevent any infections," Mocht said simply. "That rat still hasn't been found. Perhaps we need to rear a few more cats in the manor." Chapter 981. Hazel's decision. After hearing Mock's reply, and combining what he knew, Klein guessed that the rat in the manor was likely the marauder demigod which had been by Hazel's side. As for why it went rabid and bit Hazel, he was unsure. He nodded slightly and tapped his chest 4 times in a clockwise fashion. "May the goddess bless her." After saying that, he walked past the host, entered the hall, and waited for the ball tonight to begin. In a particular bedroom on the 3rd story, Hazel was sitting on a reclining chair feeling dispirited, her feet curled up. Her left hand was wrapped in thick bandages, but there weren't any more signs of blood. Her expression was heavy, nothing like her usual arrogance. In the manner, her teacher, that was in the form of a rat, had suddenly bitten her. This resulted in her being stuck in a similar state, her entire being turbid and muddled. It was as though it wasn't her hand that was bitten but her heart. To Hazel, although her arrogance stemmed from her upbringing, with her ability to absorb new information exceeding that of the average person's, her outstanding looks, her family standing in high society, and her maturity compared to her peers, those feelings were still within normal boundaries before she gained extraordinary powers. None of the aforementioned traits made her feel that she was different from others or that she was fundamentally superior to ordinary people. Therefore, with her teacher, who maintained her sense of arrogance while being a representation of her fortuitous encounter and the source of her strength, suddenly becoming a real rat, to the point of not being able to speak clearly and even bite her without any reason, it left a deep impact on her. She began to question if supernatural powers represented being extraordinary or a monster. Amidst her thoughts, Hazel subconsciously pulled her black-green hair to the back of her ear and felt frustrated with the melody that came from downstairs. At this moment, She heard the creaking sound of the door as she turned her head in hesitation. Walking in was a gray rat with slick fur. Its eyes were deeper than its kind, closer to dark red. "Hazel," the rat said in a deep voice. Hazel was first taken aback before she reeled in delight.
She hurriedly stood up and blurted, "Teacher, why have we recovered?"
Just as she said that, she saw gray rats crawling out from the corner of her bedroom, balcony, and bed. All of them had dark red eyes but could only produce squeaking sounds. Hazel took a step back in shock, overturning the reclining chair. Her body staggered, almost to the point of collapsing. It took her a great deal of effort to recover her balance. At this moment, she discovered that the red-eyed rats had vanished. The door had been shut tightly, having never opened. Everything that had happened was a hallucination or a nightmare that stemmed from the worries inside her. After a moment of silence, Hazel pursed her lips and sighed. She sat back down, raising her hand to her temples. As she massaged her temples, she frowned slightly. She had a nagging feeling that what had happened was too surreal. Her dark brown eyes darted about slightly as Hazel removed the necklace she wore around her neck, clenching it in her palm. The necklace's 7 green gems were equidistant from each other. Embedded around them were tiny diamonds. At this moment, one of the gems lit up slowly, emitting a green glow, giving her face a sheen and filling her eyes with mysterious symbols. The scenes from before surfaces in the girl's mind as her blurry dreamlike state gradually turned clear. While observing the scenes, Hazel sensed something amiss. She confirmed that she hadn't been dreaming, nor was it a short hallucination from having her mind go adrift. Instead, she had been thrown into an illusion for nearly 10 seconds. Cryptologist. This. Hazel's dark brown eyes widened as she muttered a word filled with horror. She jumped to her feet and looked around anxiously but failed to discover anything. But the more she looked, the more terrified she became. She had no idea what she would encounter next, nor did she understand what the person who created the dream was up to. The only thing she was certain of was that the other party's level and strength in the supernatural domain far exceeded hers. This shattered what little pride she had left. After a few minutes, the entire bedroom remained silent. The brisk melody from downstairs instantly connected oneself to the current dance steps. Hazel finally composed herself, believing that nothing would happen next. Only then did she have the mood or energy to consider the motives of the person who secretly cast the illusion. As various thoughts surfaced in her mind, Hazel suddenly came up with a theory. The person from before was here for her teacher. Through the illusion, the person had confirmed her teacher's current situation. Is it teacher's friend, or an enemy? He's definitely headed off to look for teacher. What do I do? He likely doesn't know where teacher is hiding. No, all my neighbors know that I was bitten by a rabid rat. Hazel was thrown into panic as she clenched her necklace with increasing strength. She couldn't be sure of the motives of the other party, nor did she know what she could do. She wished to head to the manor and inform her teacher, but she was afraid of encountering danger and end up being sacrificed. Furthermore, her teacher had seemingly lost the ability to communicate. Her warnings might not necessarily be conveyed. Without realizing it, Hazel stood up and paced about in her bedroom. Finally, she made up her mind. Pursing her lips tightly, she walked to the door and said to her lady's maid outside, "I'm a little tired. I plan on sleeping now. Don't let anyone disturb me."
"Yes, my lady," the maid immediately replied.
After closing the door, Hazel began changing into clothes that allowed for greater movement. Her expression was extremely heavy as her teeth bit down on her lip. She had finally decided to warn her teacher at the manor. She didn't wish to become a seemingly arrogant person but, in actuality, was a coward, one who would abandon all principles upon encountering danger. She found it despicable of herself. While the bodyguards were focusing their attention on the ball's attendees, Hazel took the opportunity to enter the garden using a water pipe from the balcony. When leaving 39 Buckland Street, Klein was holding onto a cup of sweet and iced fizzy wine, discussing business in the southern continent with a few gentlemen. He turned his head slightly, glancing at the garden. He had already noticed Hazel's actions thanks to his intuition. Although she's not a likable girl, she has quite a kind heart. Klein nodded indiscernibly and praised her inwardly. He wasn't worried about Hazel's actions, because to go from North Borough's Buckland Street to Mock's Manor in Backland's northwestern suburbs would take 3 to 5 hours on carriage. And before she arrived, he would have already used an excuse to leave the ball, teleporting over directly to confirm the situation. Although Mock's manor was in the northwestern suburbs, it was on the other side of the Tussock River. Hence, to head there, one needed to take a detour to an area with a bridge. It was fine in the day, as one could use the steam metro to head to the south side of the bridge beneath the river. At night, there were only 3 bridges to consider. It was inevitable to spend 5 hours traveling. Of course, as Klein had used Tinder before and had read 2 to 105 blood vessel thieves information, he had some idea about the powers of the Marauder pathway. Therefore, he suspected that Hazel, who had an item of a higher level, could steal the flight abilities of birds and use that short period of time to cross the river. This way, she might arrive within 3 hours. Regardless, I'll be faster than her. Klein retracted his gaze and began considering who his next dance partner should be. 10 in the evening, Moose Manor in the northwestern suburbs of Backlund. This place originally belonged to a viscount, and it had more than 100 years of history. Mock had bought it after his marriage, spending tons of money to maintain it every year so as to invite friends over during winter weekends for a vacation.
At this moment, the land steward was arranging for the servants to check every corner and to lock all the windows and doors.
This was a necessary procedure before they slept every night. A few maids walked out of the wine cellar in a group, heading straight for the kitchen to ensure that all flames had been extinguished. The moment they arrived, they heard squeaking sounds as they looked over, only to discover a grayish-white rat gnawing on a table leg. This rat seemed to sense their gaze, but it didn't run. Instead, it turned its head and glared at them with its slightly red eyes. Meanwhile, there were more squeaking sounds as red-eyed rats ran out from the roof beams, storage cabinets, and all kinds of miscellaneous, even appearing beside the furnace which had some water boiling over it. The maids nearly screamed in fear. As members of the lowest classes of society, they were no strangers to rats. They had even killed quite a number. However, it was their first time to encounter so many at once. They couldn't help but feel a heavy blow to their senses.
"We need to get Gede and the others to deal with this," a maid left the kitchen and suggested in fear.
Another maid nodded immediately. Miss Hazel was bitten by a rabid rat. These don't look normal in any way. As they spoke, they retreated a great distance back, distancing themselves from the kitchen. At this moment, a figure quickly appeared on the table. He wore a white shirt and black vest under a dark-colored formal suit. On his head was a half-top hat, and he had a pair of bright leather boots. This figure slowly lifted his head while holding down his hat. He surveyed the surroundings, revealing his black hair and brown eyes. He had a thin face and cut features. He was none other than Gehrman Sparrow. Having left the ball ahead of time, Klein returned to Dwayne Dantes' residence and entered his bedroom. Then, he teleported over with Winner and Uni. Of course, the latter had been left outside the manor to allow for any instantaneous switches in positions. The rats reflected into his eyes as Klein pulled the human-skinned glove on his left hand, casting his gaze towards the flower bed in the manor. Almost at the same time, the rats in the kitchen stirred as their movements turned sluggish. However, they quickly returned to normal. They had become a Bizarro sorcerer's marionettes. And Klein could control as many as 50 marionettes, a number that would rise once he finished digesting the potion. Chapter 982 Bizarro Sorcerer vs. Parasite. When he cast his gaze towards the garden, the scene of the area was naturally reflected in Klein's mind. In the dark corner concealed by the flowers, grayish-white rats spun around wildly like they had been possessed. They kept squeaking as they attempted to push away their own kind and enter the core area. In the core area lay a gray rat the size of an adult lone short-hair, a particular cat breed. Its eyes were slightly red like congealed blood. Its tail was swishing about rapidly, seemingly in a bid to vent the irascible feelings within. And whenever ordinary-sized rats approached, it would grab them and bite them to their deaths, causing rat corpses to pile up around it. But even so, this didn't stop the other rats from surging over. Upon seeing this scene, Klein suddenly had 2 thoughts. First, having his intuition boosted by the gray fog was a boon for a Bizarro sorcerer's controlling of spirit body threads. This wasn't apparent in open areas where the owner of the spirit body threads could be instantly determined. But when inside a bustling city or a place with many buildings, Bizarro sorcerers who lacked X-ray vision were unable to determine the owners of the spirit body threads that bunched up from afar. It made it difficult to accurately lock onto an enemy unless they did something special, making them stand out from others. Of course, Bizarro sorcerers could also ignore the possibility of collateral damage and just indiscriminately control their targets. Second, the marauder pathway demigod that parasitized the rat was already on the verge of losing control. Not only was it several times bigger than when a road showed it, but its condition appeared very unstable. It was filled with a violent and crazy aura. Thankfully, I came in time. If I had waited a few weeks, who knows what kind of tragedy would unfold? A thought flashed across Klein's mind as illusory black threads appeared in front of him. At this moment, he was less than 50 meters away from the mutated rat, making it completely feasible for him to control the spirit body threads. And at this moment, the huge rat with slick fur noticed something. It hurriedly stood up and turned its head towards the kitchen. A glint flashed in its dark red eyes, instantly leaving the young man wearing a silk hat and black suit pausing in his spot. It had stolen the main thoughts of the antagonizer for the next 2 seconds, leaving his mind blank. Furthermore, it didn't do the follow-up actions that a Sequence 5 Dream Stealer would have done. Right on the heels of that, this rat raised its right forelimb and attempted to steal the enemy's Beyonder powers. At its level, it was able to steal 3 Beyonder powers from the same target and possess them for 2 hours. Of course, one attempt was limited to 1 power. At this moment, the gigantic rat's thoughts turned extraordinarily sluggish. The actions of it using its powers seemed to be bound by invisible threads, making it appear extremely lethargic. Initial control of its spirit body threads had been obtained. Its success at stealing Gairman Sparrow's thoughts and throwing him into a daze was merely an illusion, a Bizarro sorcerer's illusion creation. Before Klein properly began controlling its spirit body threads, Klein had already switched places with Anuni. As a marionette didn't possess any self-consciousness or thoughts, it was immune to the Beyonder powers of thought usurpation. How could something that didn't exist be stolen? And in order to trick the marauder pathway demigod, Klein had used his illusion powers which had experienced a qualitative upgrade. He had also deliberately made Anuni, who wore Gairman Sparrow's appearance, put on the corresponding act. At this moment, he was outside Mox Moose Manor. His straight-line distance from the gigantic rat exceeded 500 meters. However, this didn't stop him from controlling his opponent's spirit body threads. This was because a Bizarro sorcerer could gift his Beyonder powers to his marionette. This included the control over spirit body threads, the core for converting a target into a marionette. This also meant that if there weren't any other restrictions, a Bizarro sorcerer could use their marionette and extend his control of spirit body threads from 150 meters to an unlimited range. After all, as long as there was a marionette placed every 1,000 kilometers, he could rely on extending his influence by gifting his Beyonder powers. Of course, there was no ability in the world without restrictions. On the one hand, Klein's maximum number of marionettes was 50, and it was currently impossible to exceed this number. On the other hand, the only thing that a Bizarro sorcerer couldn't gift his marionette was the ability to think and be self-conscious. Therefore, the limit of using a marionette to control a marionette was the limit of his control over a marionette, 1,000 meters. Once he exceeded this range, the marionette wouldn't be able to do anything. In addition, by gifting his Beyonder powers to his marionette, a Bizarro sorcerer was effectively separating a maggot that was related to his mythical creature form. It was transferred into the marionette's body via the spirit body threads. Unless he had prepared via giving the same marionette additional maggots, the marionette lacked the means of separating another maggot when converting a new marionette or giving the new marionette his Beyonder powers. And at present, Klein could only split a maximum of 50. Exceeding this number exerted a huge burden on his spirit body and produced signs of his soul fracturing. Recovery was impossible without effective treatment, and it was possible to not recover, even with excellent treatment. It would only increase the possibility of losing control. Therefore, through Klein's experiments, the maximum distance he could control spirit body threads was 1,000 plus 150 meters. And to be able to fully control a new marionette, it needed to be within 1,000 meters. At the same time, if the marionette were to die, the maggot inside the body would return to his body according to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence. However, there was a chance of experiencing a loss if the process was interrupted. While the marauder pathway demigod's actions turned sluggish, the rats that had previously been turned into marionettes rushed out from Anuni's side. They aimed at the garden and opened their mouths in a bid to use air cannon to cleanse the target's location. Suddenly, a dark red glimmer lit up in the gigantic rat's eyes. Instantly, Gehrman's sparrow appeared in the dark corner of the garden, amidst the dead rats. As for the marauder pathway demigod, it had arrived inside the kitchen where there were plenty of items on the table. It had stolen Gehrman's sparrow's position. Bang! 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 The marionette rats shot out their air cannons without being able to stop midway, hitting the spot where Gehrman's sparrow was standing. It left the soil splattering and threw the flowers into the sky. It alarmed the servants in the manor as their bodies trembled violently. They had no idea what was happening and could only frantically run for shelter. The entire garden was leveled by air cannon, thinning the layer of soil within. If Klein hadn't directed the attack in that direction, the manor's main building probably would have collapsed. Amidst the flying dust, the rats were left dismembered, but Gehrman's sparrow remained standing there, uninjured. Winner Anuni had just released all the good luck he had accumulated. However, his control of the gigantic rat's spirit body threads had been terminated as a result. And there were only a limited number of spirit body threads. The rat marionettes were unable to interfere, for it might create pandemonium and cancel each other out. Hazel's teacher, the marauder pathway demigod, took this opportunity to regain its freedom. Then it turned around and raised its right forearm at Gehrman's sparrow, instantly stealing his beyonder powers of controlling spirit body threads. As a Sequence 4 demigod, it could accurately steal the power of the target. Typically there were 3 options, and with better understanding, the higher the chance of success was. And this time, its luck was pretty good. Of course, if the target's level was much lower, and if it clearly knew of the target's situation, it could steal anything it wanted. Just as it lowered its right paw, the marauder pathway demigod raised its left paw. The rat marionettes slumped to the ground and could hardly turn their bodies. This was a large-scale theft that stole the rat's ability to walk. Right on the heels of that, countless magical symbols appeared in the gigantic rat's red eyes. It rapidly decrypted the puzzle and found where Klein was. With a red glint, it raised both paws and instantly appeared beside Klein. This time it had stolen the distance between the two. At this moment, the thin-faced young man in front of the rat vanished. Replacing him was a gray rat. And around the surrounding trees, worms began crawling out as they opened their mouths. Bang! 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 Air cannons bombarded the gigantic rat and ordinary rat. While Klein was controlling the marionettes in the Moose Manor, he didn't forget to convert new marionettes around him. This was, after all, a basic trait of a bizarro sorcerer. Then, swapping his body with a marionette, he had set up a simple trap. Dust and soil flew high into the sky as the rat parasitized by the marauder pathway demigod was completely inundated by it. After everything settled down, a strong scent of blood emanated from the huge crater. There were pieces of flesh everywhere. Dead. Klein looked at the blast-filled scene with the eyes of his surrounding marionettes. However, he quickly frowned because there weren't any signs of a beyonder characteristic appearing. As his thoughts raced, Klein took out a gold coin and flicked it. As the gold coin landed, scenes surfaced in his mind. Revelations from his astral projection. Compared to the past, as a demigod, Klein could use such a simple divination to obtain more information. You're tuning in to the Xiaofan's Wuxia Tales YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.